The Soviet column stopped moving at 14:37 hours, not because the commander ordered it, not because of mechanical failure. The column stopped because the forest had swallowed the road ahead. 30 meters of packed snow. Trees felled in a perfect barricade across the only route through the frozen wilderness. The first truck exploded. Metal and burning fuel erupted into the pale afternoon sky. Men screamed. Officers shouted orders that nobody could hear over the roar of flames. Then the last truck exploded. 4,000 Russian soldiers trapped between two walls of fire on a forest road so narrow their tanks couldn't turn around. The temperature was 42 degrees below zero. The sun was already setting at 3 p.m., and somewhere in the white silence surrounding them, men they couldn't see were closing in. Men who had been watching them for hours. Men who knew exactly how long it would take for panic to set in. The Soviets called for air support. The radio operator's hands were shaking so badly from cold, he could barely hold the receiver. His fingers were turning black at the tips. When he finally got through, the voice on the other end told him what he already knew. No planes. The snow was too thick. The temperature had frozen the fuel lines. The airfields were socked in with fog so dense you couldn't see 10 meters. They were alone, completely and utterly alone in a forest that wanted them dead. By midnight, the screaming had stopped. By dawn, the entire column, 4,000 men, 56 tanks, hundreds of vehicles, had ceased to exist. The Finns would later call this engagement Motti. The Russians had a simpler word for it, hell. But this wasn't an isolated massacre. This was doctrine. This was art. This was what happened when 500,000 Soviet soldiers invaded a country of farmers, and the farmers decided to teach them what winter actually meant. This is the story the Soviets tried to erase. The Winter War, when the largest army on Earth marched into the snow, and the snow fought back. November 30th, 1939. The Soviet Union, fresh from carving up Poland with Nazi Germany, turned its eyes north to Finland, a tiny nation of 3.5 million people sitting on Russia's doorstep, a country most Soviet generals couldn't find on a map without help. Stalin wanted buffer territory. He wanted naval bases on the Baltic. He wanted Finland to bend the knee the way every other neighbor had. When the Finns refused, when they dared to tell the Soviet Union no, Stalin didn't negotiate. Stalin didn't compromise. He sent the Red Army. The numbers were apocalyptic. Over 500,000 Soviet troops poured across the border on the morning of November 30th. 6,000 tanks rolled through Finnish border towns, crushing fences and farmhouses under their treads. 3,000 aircraft filled the skies. Artillery batteries that stretched for kilometers began shelling Finnish positions before the declaration of war had even been officially delivered. This was the largest invasion force assembled in Europe since World War I, and it was aimed at a country with a standing army of 300,000 men, most of them reservists who had been farmers and lumberjacks the week before, an air force you could count on two hands, and a tank corps that consisted of exactly 30 vehicles, most of them obsolete French models from the previous war. The Soviet press called it a liberation. International observers called it inevitable. The British military attaché in Helsinki estimated Finland would last 2 weeks before complete collapse. The French gave them 10 days. The Americans quietly wrote off the entire nation and moved on to more pressing concerns. Betting pools opened in Moscow on how many days it would take to reach Helsinki. The math was obscene. For every Finnish soldier, there were nearly 2 Russians. For every Finnish rifle, the Soviets had 5. Finland had 30 tanks. The Soviets had 6,000. The disparity wasn't military. It was existential. It was mathematics that pointed to only one conclusion: total annihilation. And Stalin's generals knew it. They had already drawn up plans for a victory parade in Helsinki within 2 weeks. Dress uniforms had been packed. Medals had been pre-approved. The Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov announced to the international press with absolute confidence that the Red Army would be dining in Helsinki before Christmas. The soldiers crossing the border believed it too. This wasn't going to be a war. It was going to be a walkover, a formality. A couple of weeks in the cold, maybe a few skirmishes with terrified Finnish conscripts, and then back to Moscow with medals and stories and the warm glow of easy victory. The forest had other ideas. The men waiting in the snow were not soldiers. not in the way Stalin understood soldiers. They hadn't graduated from military academies. They hadn't trained on parade grounds. They didn't know how to march in formation or salute properly. They were lumberjacks, farmers, hunters, men who had spent their entire lives in forests so dense you could walk for days without seeing the sky. Men who knew how to read animal tracks and fresh powder at a glance, who could tell you what a deer had eaten 3 days ago by examining its droppings. Men who could ski 40 kilometers through a blizzard in complete darkness and arrive at a coordinate without a map, guided only by the slope of the land and the direction of the wind. They didn't wear parade uniforms with polished buttons and pressed creases. They wore white sheets over their civilian clothes, old bed linens salvaged from farmhouses, torn curtains, anything that would make them invisible against the snow. Some had sewn their own camouflage from scratch, stitching together scraps of white fabric by candlelight in kitchens that still smelled of their wives' cooking. Their rifles were ancient. Most carried the Mosin-Nagant, a bolt-action rifle from World War I that required manual reloading after every shot. No automatic fire, no rapid repeat, just one careful shot at a time. But these men didn't need automatic fire. They had grown up hunting elk and bear in these same forests. They knew that one shot, placed correctly, was all you ever needed. They had no tanks, no artillery, no air support, no radio communications, no backup. What they had was the forest, and they knew how to make it kill. The Finnish defense forces had mobilized every able-bodied man in the country. Teenagers lied about their age to enlist, adding 2 or 3 years to their birth certificates with forged stamps. Grandfathers who had fought in Finland's civil war 20 years earlier picked up rifles they had kept oiled in attics and barns, wrapped in cloth against the moisture, waiting for the day they might be needed again. Women who stayed behind sewed white camouflage smocks from bedsheets and curtains, their fingers bleeding from the needles as they worked through the night. They melted snow for cooking because the wells had frozen solid. They kept farms running while their husbands, their sons, their brothers vanished into the forests with rifles and skis and a quiet promise to come back. Some of them would not keep that promise. The Finnish commander-in-chief, Field Marshal Carl Gustaf Emil Mannerheim, was 72 years old, a former officer in the Russian Imperial Army who had served the Tsar for 30 years before Finland's independence. He knew exactly how Soviet commanders thought because he had been one. He knew their doctrine, their tactics, their weaknesses. He knew they valued mass over skill, firepower over precision, and he knew their greatest weakness: arrogance. The Soviets marched in columns, tight, organized parade ground formations designed for open terrain and paved roads. They brought their supply trucks, their field kitchens, their officers' carriages. Everything moved together in a single, massive, trackable target that kicked up dust clouds visible for kilometers in summer and left tracks in the snow that a blind man could follow in winter. The Finns didn't march. They glided, on skis, through forests so thick Soviet tanks couldn't follow, where the trees grew so close together, a man had to turn sideways to slip between them. They moved at night, when the temperature dropped so low that exhaling made a cloud of ice crystals that hung in the air like frozen breath, like ghosts. They attacked supply depots, ammunition dumps, field kitchens. They cut communication wires, they sniped officers from 400 meters away, and disappeared before the body count was finished, before anyone even knew which direction the shot had come from. And when the Soviets tried to pursue them into the trees, the forest swallowed the Russians whole. December the 7th, 1939. The Soviet 44th Rifle Division, nearly 18,000 men strong, pushed deep into Finnish territory along a narrow forest road near the village of Suomussalmi. The road was the only route through the region. Dense forest on both sides, trees so thick they blocked out the sun even at noon. Frozen lakes to the north, their surfaces covered with ice strong enough to walk on, but not strong enough to support a tank. Impassable marshland to the south, hidden beneath the snow. The division moved in a column 15 kilometers long, tanks at the front, supply trucks in the middle, artillery at the rear, officers and heated cars in the center. It was a textbook Soviet advance. Overwhelming force, clear objective, straightforward logistics, everything the academies taught. And then the road disappeared. Finnish ski troops had spent the night before the Soviet advance felling trees across the road, hundreds of them. Massive pines that had been growing for a century, brought down with axes and saws in the darkness, creating barricades every few hundred meters that forced the column to stop, dismount, and clear the obstacles manually in the freezing cold. While the Russians worked, their breath steaming in the brutal cold, clearing timber with frozen hands and axes that became so brittle in the temperature that they shattered when they struck wood, Finnish marksmen watched from the tree line, waiting, counting, calculating. The first shots came from nowhere. Officers dropped mid-sentence, their words cut off by the crack of a rifle they never heard. Radio operators slumped over their equipment, blood pooling on the frozen metal. Drivers trying to restart stalled engines took bullets through the windshield, the glass spiderwebbing around the entry hole. And every time the Soviets turned to return fire, there was nothing but white silence. No muzzle flash, no movement, nothing. The Finns didn't engage, they vanished, like smoke and wind. By nightfall, the Soviet column was spread across 15 kilometers of frozen forest road, unable to move forward or back. The temperature dropped to minus 38 degrees Celsius. Soldiers huddled around fires that gave away their positions, because freezing to death was a certainty, and a Finnish bullet was only a possibility. Frostbite claimed more men than bullets that first night. And then the Finns attacked. Ski troops hit the column from both sides simultaneously, appearing out of the darkness like vengeful spirits. Not a frontal assault, not a siege, a dissection. They cut the column into isolated segments with surgical precision. 1,000 men here, 2,000 there, separated by kilometers of hostile forest, with no communication, no resupply, no way to coordinate, no idea if the units ahead or behind them even still existed. The Soviets called these isolated pockets Motti. The Finns had a different term. Killing boxes. Soviet soldiers in the Motti pockets faced an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't hear, and couldn't predict. An enemy that seemed to materialize from the snow itself. Finnish ski troops moved through the forest like ghosts, white camouflage against white snow. Silent, fast, invisible until the moment they opened fire. They attacked at dawn and dusk when visibility was worst, when the light played tricks and every shadow could be death. They sabotaged vehicles, pouring sand into fuel tanks. They poisoned fuel supplies with tree sap that turned to gum in the engines. They cut supply lines, leaving Russian soldiers to starve in the cold. And when Soviet troops tried to break out, tried to fight their way through the Finnish lines to rejoin the main force, the Finns simply melted back into the trees and let the cold finish the job. The cold was the real killer, the silent executioner that worked while men slept. Minus 40 degrees Celsius turns metal brittle. Rifle bolts froze solid, fused into place by ice that formed in the mechanisms overnight. Machine guns seized after a few bursts, the heat of firing creating moisture that instantly froze when the shooting stopped. Tank engines refused to start, and when they did, the fuel lines cracked from the temperature shock, spilling diesel that froze into black slush before it could ignite. Soviet soldiers, dressed in standard-issue wool uniforms designed for Ukrainian winters, not Arctic ones, froze to death in their sleeping bags. They went to sleep and simply never woke up. Frostbite turned hands black, then gray, then hard as wood. Fingers broke off like dry twigs. Feet swelled inside boots until the leather split. Men urinated blood because their kidneys were shutting down from hypothermia. The ones who survived the night woke to find their closest friends frozen solid beside them, eyes still open, staring at nothing. And through it all, the Finns kept coming. One man became a legend the Soviets would spend decades trying to forget. A ghost story told in whispers around frozen campfires. His name was Simo Heiha, a farmer from the Finnish countryside, 5 feet 3 inches tall, quiet, unremarkable. He looked like someone's grandfather, the kind of man you would pass on the street without a second glance. He was the most lethal sniper in human history. Heiha operated alone, no spotter, no radio, no backup, just his rifle, a Mosin-Nagant with iron sights, and the patience of a man who had spent his entire life hunting elk in the Finnish wilderness, where a single wrong move, a single sound, meant hours of tracking wasted. He wore white. He moved at dawn when the light was weakest. He positioned himself in snowdrifts so deep only his rifle barrel and eyes were visible, and sometimes not even that. And he waited. For hours, sometimes for days. Motionless. A statue of ice and patience. Soviet officers died first, then radio operators, then anyone who looked like they were giving orders, organizing defenses, trying to bring order to chaos. He-ha didn't take risky shots. He didn't shoot at movement or shadows. He took certain ones. Shots he knew would hit, shots he knew would kill. And he never missed. The Soviets sent counter-sniper teams after him, trained marksmen with scoped rifles and orders to find the ghost and kill him. He killed them. All of them. They sent entire squads to sweep the forests, hundreds of men beating through the snow, looking for one small man in white. He relocated before they arrived. They called in artillery strikes on suspected positions, dropping shells on empty snow. He was already gone, already moving to his next hunting ground. Over the course of the Winter War, Simo He-ha killed over 500 Soviet soldiers. Confirmed kills, witnessed, documented, not estimates, not guesses. 500 men who woke up that morning and went to sleep in the snow because a farmer decided they needed to die. The Soviets called him Belaya Smrt, White Death. They feared him more than artillery, more than tanks, more than airstrikes, because artillery you could hear coming, tanks you could see, airstrikes you could hide from. But White Death? White Death came from nowhere. 1 second you were giving orders, the next you were dead in the snow, and nobody knew where the shot had come from. Nobody even knew he had been there. He-ha was hit in the face by an explosive bullet in March 1940, 1 week before the war ended. Half his jaw was blown off. His left cheek was destroyed. He survived, recovered, lived to 96 years old. He never talked about the war, not once, not to journalists, not to historians, not to his family. When asked how many men he had killed, he would smile with what remained of his face and change the subject. The Finns had no anti-tank weapons, no bazookas, no anti-tank rifles, no mines, nothing in their arsenal that could stop steel. The Soviets knew this. Their tank commanders rolled into Finnish territory with absolute confidence, sitting in machines that no rifle bullet could penetrate. 6,000 armored vehicles, T-26 light tanks, T-28 mediums, T-7 fast tanks capable of 50 kilometers per hour on roads, faster than most men could run. What could farmers possibly do against steel? The Finns improvised. They filled glass bottles, vodka bottles, beer bottles, wine bottles, anything with a neck, with gasoline, kerosene, and tar. They stuffed a rag into the mouth, soaked it in fuel, lit it on fire, and threw it at the tanks. The bottles shattered on impact. The fuel ignited. Physics did the rest. The Soviets had a name for these improvised weapons. They called them Molotov cocktails, named mockingly after Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov, who had claimed the Soviet bombs dropping on Finnish cities were humanitarian food aid. If the bombs were food, the Finns said, then here was their drink to go with it. The Finns embraced the name, and they turned it into doctrine. Finnish ski troops worked in pairs. One man carried the bottle, the other carried a rifle for cover. They approached Soviet tanks at night, skiing silently through the trees, getting within throwing distance before the crews even knew they were there. Close enough to see the rivets in the armor, close enough to hear the Russians talking inside. The bottles shattered against engine grills, turret vents, exhaust ports. The fuel ignited on contact, rushing into every gap in the armor. Fire poured into the crew compartment through vision slits and hatches. Tanks that had been considered invincible became rolling crematoriums. Men burned alive inside steel boxes that had been built to protect them. Soviet crews learned to sleep inside their tanks rather than beside them, thinking the armor would keep them safe. It didn't help. The Finns simply waited until morning, when the crews had to open the hatches to start the frozen engines and let out the condensation that had formed overnight. A bottle through an open hatch killed everyone inside. Hundreds of Soviet tanks burned in the Finnish forests. The snow around them melted from the heat. The ground beneath turned to black slush, thick with ash and melted rubber, and the charred wrecks sat there as warnings to the next column coming through, tombstones of steel. But the Soviets kept coming, because Stalin had given orders, and disobeying Stalin was worse than dying in the snow. By January 1940, the Soviet offensive had ground to a frozen standstill. Entire divisions were encircled in Motti pockets, slowly starving and freezing. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers through hostile territory, where every truck that tried to get through was ambushed, every train was derailed, every convoy was destroyed. Officers were being killed faster than Moscow could replace them. Morale had collapsed. Soldiers were surrendering to Finnish patrols in groups of 50, 100, sometimes more, begging to be taken prisoner just to escape the cold. And Stalin was furious. He sacked his field commanders, replacing them with harder men who cared even less about casualties. He sent fresh divisions from Siberia, men who knew cold but had never seen combat. He authorized unlimited artillery bombardment of Finnish positions. He didn't care about casualties anymore. He didn't care about international opinion. He cared about victory, about not being humiliated by farmers. The Soviets changed tactics. No more narrow forest roads, no more long columns. They massed their forces on the Karelian Isthmus, a strip of open ground between Lake Ladoga and the Gulf of Finland. Open terrain, no trees, nowhere to hide, nowhere for the Finnish ghosts to operate. They brought 1,000 guns, artillery pieces positioned wheel to wheel, so close together you could walk across their barrels, firing in synchronized barrages that turned the Finnish defensive line into a moonscape. They sent wave after wave of infantry, human waves that didn't stop coming, even when the front ranks were cut down. Tanks rolled forward in groups of 50, crushing barbed wire under their treads. Aircraft bombed Finnish positions around the clock. It was industrial warfare, meat grinder tactics, Stalin's solution to the Finnish problem. Drown them in blood and steel until there's nothing left. The Finns held for 2 months. 2 months of artillery fire so intense the ground shook continuously, 24 hours a day. 2 months of Soviet infantry assaults that came every day, sometimes twice a day, sometimes 3 times. Finnish soldiers slept in their foxholes, ate in their foxholes, died in their foxholes. There was nowhere else to go. They ran out of ammunition, they ran out of food, they ran out of medical supplies. Wounded men lay in frozen trenches for days because there were no stretcher bearers left to carry them out, no doctors left to treat them, no morphine left to ease their pain. And still, they held. On March 13, 1940, Finland signed a peace treaty with the Soviet Union. The war was over. Finland lost 10% of its territory. 30,000 Finnish soldiers lay dead in the snow. Over 70,000 were wounded. Entire villages had been erased, families destroyed, a generation scarred. But Finland survived. The Soviet Union, the largest military machine on Earth, the army that would later crush Nazi Germany and plant its flag on the Reichstag, lost over 160,000 men. Some estimates put the number closer to 300,000. They lost thousands of tanks, reduced to smoking wrecks and frozen forests. Hundreds of aircraft shot down or crashed. Entire divisions that ceased to exist as functioning units. They won the war on paper, but they lost it in the snow. Stalin never publicly acknowledged the casualties. Soviet records buried the Winter War in bureaucratic language and classified reports that would remain sealed for 50 years. The generals who survived were quietly reassigned to distant posts. The soldiers who came home didn't talk about what they saw, couldn't talk about it. The shame was too great. But the world had been watching. Hitler watched, and he learned the wrong lesson. He saw the Soviet Union bleed against Finland and concluded that the Red Army was weak, incompetent, easy prey. That decision would cost him everything 2 years later when he invaded the Soviet Union and found an army that had learned from its mistakes. The Allies watched, and they saw something unexpected: courage, discipline, brilliance. A nation of 3.5 million that refused to die. The Finns called their defense sisu, a word that has no direct translation in any language. It means endurance beyond reason, resilience beyond logic. The refusal to quit even when quitting is the only rational choice. The decision to keep fighting when every calculation says you should surrender. It means standing in minus 40-degree cold with a frozen rifle and a half-empty magazine, watching an army of 500,000 men march toward you through the snow, and deciding they're the ones who should be afraid. The forests of Finland are quiet now. The snow has covered the wrecks. The Motti pockets have filled in. The burnt tanks have rusted into the earth, slowly disappearing beneath moss and pine needles. But somewhere in those woods, carved into a frozen tree by a Finnish soldier in 1940, there's a single sentence. Here, the forest fought back.